He leaned close enough that I felt his breath on my ear and whispered, "We already picked your grave." I didn't flinch. At 76, you learn a certain discipline of the face, how to keep your skin still while everything inside you collapses or rearranges itself into something harder. I simply straightened the collar of my cardigan and looked past Thomas, out the kitchen window, where the late autumn wind stirred the dry leaves like restless thoughts. "You shouldn't joke like that," I said. My voice sounded steadier than my heartbeat. But he wasn't joking. I saw it in the way his eyes didn't blink. He had the same expression he wore at 13 when he lied about breaking the neighbor's window, a strange mix of guilt and boldness, as if he wanted to see how far he could push before someone stopped him. No one stopped him then. Perhaps that was our first mistake. He stepped back, casual, hands in the pockets of his new jacket. "I'm just trying to help you, Aunt Margaret. You shouldn't live alone anymore. It's time to think practically." Practically. People love that word when they want to take something from you. I reached for the kettle, letting the warmth of the handle steady me. "I've lived here for 43 years, I said. "Your uncle and I built this house with our bare hands." He smiled. "And times change." Behind him, his wife Laura hovered near the doorframe, pretending to be absorbed in her phone. She was always pretending to care, pretending to visit out of affection, pretending she didn't flinch every time she sat on my old couch as though it might stain her clothes. I heard her whisper into the phone once, not knowing I'd stepped into the hallway. "She's holding on to that land out of habit. She'll be gone soon anyway." Gone. Like I was a calendar event they'd already penciled in. Thomas cleared his throat, the way he does when he wants to shift from threats to persuasion. "Look, the retirement home I mentioned has space, and Laura and I have been talking. It doesn't make sense for you to stay here alone. The house is too big, too old. The land—" He stopped, too quickly. And that was when something inside me woke up. Years ago, my late husband kept a drawer full of documents, old deeds, maps, contracts written in the kind of cursive that belonged to another era. I hadn't touched that drawer in years. It felt like reaching back into a life that had ended the day he did. But now, as Thomas stumbled over the word land, a sharp, unwelcome clarity swept through me. He knew something, or thought he did. I poured myself tea, though my hand trembled slightly. Thomas noticed. He always notices weakness first. He stepped closer again, lowering his voice to that falsely gentle register he uses on his insurance clients. "Aunt Margaret, nothing bad is going to happen to you. We're just planning ahead. We want you safe." Safe. Another word that means the opposite of what it pretends. When he left, both of them giving those stiff little hugs that feel more like rehearsal than affection, I stood at the kitchen table long after the door closed. My house creaked around me, the old beams shifting as they always have when the wind runs along the roofline. Usually, the sound comforts me. Today, it felt like the house was exhaling with worry. I set the teacup down and walked to the study. The drawer resisted at first, swollen slightly from years of humidity, but I pulled it open, and the scent of old paper rose like dust from memory. There were folders tied with string, brittle envelopes, a map with edges eaten by time, and there, at the very bottom, was the deed. I recognized my husband's handwriting on the corner, a note he'd written decades ago, faded but legible. "For her, only her. Promise me she'll keep it." My hands stilled. Outside, the wind pushed harder against the house. Inside, something colder settled into my bones. Thomas had whispered to me about graves, but he had no idea whose ground he was standing on. Morning light always exposes the things you tried to ignore the night before. I woke to the pale, washed-out sun slipping through the curtains, and for a moment I could almost pretend nothing had happened. But memory has its own cruel punctuality. By the time my feet touched the floor, I heard Thomas's whisper again, cold, close, purposeful. I made my slow way to the kitchen. The kettle hummed the way it always had, the same hum I'd heard when my husband was alive, when the world was simpler and quieter. It should have soothed me. But it didn't. Not today. Laura had left her usual traces. A faint perfume in the hallway, the refrigerator door not fully closed, a coaster left askew on the living room table. She never touched anything directly, always through napkins or with the tips of her fingers, as though my home were coated in something unpleasant. She thought I didn't notice. At my age, people forget how sharply we observe. When life slows you down, you start seeing everything others rush past. I sat at the table, wrapping my hands around my cup. My joints complained with their morning stiffness, but that discomfort is reliable, almost friendly. Not like the new discomfort Thomas had brought into my house yesterday. Around 9, there was a knock at the door. Soft, polite. Definitely not Thomas. He never knocks softly. It was my neighbor, Helen, wearing her gardening hat and holding a small jar of her blackberry jam. She always brings me something when she thinks I look faded, as she calls it. "You weren't at church last Sunday," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Everything all right?" "I'm fine," I answered, though the lie sat heavily between us. Her eyes were kind, but they were also sharp enough to catch the unsettled air around me. "I heard someone was asking about your back acreage," she said casually, as if it were gossip about the weather. "A young fellow. Didn't recognize him." I nodded, pretending to be surprised. Inside, I felt that cold settling deeper, so Thomas had already started circling, not even bothering to hide it well. Helen stayed only 15 minutes, but her words lingered long after she'd gone. Someone asking about my land. Someone who wasn't heir to anything, nor entitled to a single blade of the grass that grew on it. My husband had bought that land with the stubborn pride of a man who always planned for the future, even when the present was falling apart. We had worked that soil with our hands. We planted fruit trees and buried 3 family dogs there. It was the last piece of him that the world hadn't tried to take. In the afternoon, Laura arrived again. She didn't call first, though she pretended she had. She appeared in the doorway with her polite, brittle smile. "I just came to see how you're feeling," she said. "Yesterday must have been overwhelming for you." I looked at her for a long moment. She avoided my gaze, scanning my living room like she was doing an inspection. "What exactly do you think overwhelmed me?" I asked. She blinked. "Oh, well, conversations about the future can be difficult for people your age." People your age. There it was, the quiet cruelty of someone who thinks she's being gentle. "I'm not planning to leave this house," I told her. She sighed, as if I were a stubborn child. "Margaret, we just want what's best. You need safer surroundings, medical staff, structure. A proper facility would give you all that. Thomas and I can't keep worrying about you falling, or having a stroke, or—" "Thomas didn't mention being worried," I said. "He mentioned arrangements." Her face tightened for a fraction of a second. It was enough. She busied herself with adjusting a vase on the mantel, though nothing needed adjusting. "He means well," she said lightly. "And you know how emotional he gets about responsibility. The land, the property, it's all a bit much for him right now. He's trying to make everything easier." Easier. Funny word, too. Usually means easier for them, not for me. When she finally left, claiming she had an appointment, the house exhaled with relief. I sat in my armchair, the old springs gently dipping under my weight, thinking about words. Safe, practical, easier. None of them had anything to do with my well-being. They were building a story in their heads where I was the problem that needed solving. But as I looked around at the walls my husband painted, the shelves he built, the faint grooves in the wooden floor where his boots used to press, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not even anger. Resolve. A quiet, anchored resolve that spread through me like warmth after a long, cold walk. They thought I was fading. They thought I'd lost my clarity, my strength, my hold on the world. But they didn't understand the kind of woman I was raised to be. I had survived loss deeper than anything Thomas had ever faced. I had buried the love of my life without letting my voice shake at the funeral. I had handled bills, broken fences, storms, loneliness, without calling anyone at midnight for help. Age had softened my skin, not my mind. Tomorrow, I decided, I would take the deed to someone who understood its weight. Tonight, I would let the house settle, let the wind pass, let the truth sharpen. Thomas whispered to me about graves, but I was beginning to understand something important about him too. He'd mistaken my silence for surrender. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of fear. Fear comes sharp and quickly, like a broken plate hitting the floor. What I felt was slower, heavier, the way fog settles over a field and refuses to lift. I lay awake listening to the old rafters creak under the wind, and every sound reminded me that this house had stood with me through every sorrow. Now it seemed to be waiting for my next move. By morning, I knew exactly where I needed to start. The study was colder than the rest of the house. It always had been. The sunlight reached it late in the day, and the window sash rattled even in gentle weather. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and opened the drawer again, the one that had held my husband's papers for all these years. Dust rose from the edges like it recognized me, like it had been expecting this moment long before I did. Inside were memories of a life built inch by inch. Letters with yellowed corners, receipts from hardware stores that no longer existed, maps with penciled markings from the days when my husband still believed we'd turn the back acreage into an orchard. He'd had so many plans. Some we fulfilled. Some we ran out of years for. But it was the thick folder, tied with a piece of frayed twine, that drew my attention. The knot slipped apart easily, as though it cooperated out of respect. Inside were the land documents, older than I'd remembered, older even than our marriage. Deeds from the previous owners, mineral rights, property lines drawn when surveying was still done with chains and compass. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal, feeling the grooves, the authority in them. And then, tucked behind the last page, I found the note again. My husband's handwriting. Firm, careful, the way he wrote when he wanted to be absolutely sure I understood him. For her, only her. Promise me she'll keep it. I read those words 3 times, not because I didn't understand them, but because they felt like he was here again, standing behind me with his warm hands on my shoulders. He had known something, even then. Maybe not about Thomas, not about what the boy would grow into, but about people's hunger for land, real land, untouched land, the kind they don't make anymore. I carried the folder to the kitchen table. Sunlight washed over the papers, revealing every crease, every aging stain. I sat down slowly, easing my knees into the chair, and began reading through each document. I traced the borders of the property with my fingertip, following the line that curved around the back hill and cut straight across the old pasture. It was larger than I remembered, much larger. I could almost hear Thomas's voice in my mind, that clipped, impatient tone he used whenever responsibility brushed against him. "It's too much for you. You can't manage this alone." But he didn't understand that I wasn't managing it. I was simply living on it. Living isn't the same as managing. Living doesn't require permission. Around noon, I made myself a sandwich and sat by the window. The blackberry bushes along the fence shivered in the wind. When I looked closer, I noticed tire tracks in the dirt. Not from Helen, not from the mail truck. Another car had been here sometime in the last day. The imprints were clean, fresh, wide tires. Not Laura's sedan. So he'd already brought someone. Maybe a surveyor, maybe a developer, maybe both. The thought settled like a cold coin behind my ribs. I went back to the table, pulled the oldest deed toward me, and read the fine print. It took a while. My eyes aren't what they used to be, and the cursive was nearly ornamental. But the meaning was unmistakable. The land, in its entirety, had been purchased under my husband's name, and later transferred, quietly, thoroughly, to mine. It had never passed to Thomas, not even in theory. A strange calm filled me then, not triumph, not relief, something deeper, like a tide turning. In the afternoon, I found the spare key to my husband's metal box. It had rusted around the edges, but it still opened with a familiar groan. Inside lay his old pocket knife, a photograph of us from our first year in the house, and a small envelope sealed with wax. I remembered the envelope vaguely, something he'd meant to discuss, something that had never come up again. I broke the wax. Inside was a folded letter, his handwriting again. "If anything ever threatens this land, go to Harris. He'll know what to do." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the name. Harris. That would be William Harris, the attorney who lived 2 towns over. A man my husband trusted with matters too serious to mention aloud. I hadn't seen him in years. I didn't even know if he still practiced. But I knew one thing. This was no longer about Thomas's casual cruelty, nor Laura's rehearsed concern. This was about something they were preparing for, something they believed I was too old, too confused to notice. I closed the box gently and stood, steadying myself with a hand on the table. My body protested, but my mind did not. Tomorrow, I would visit Harris. Today, I allowed myself one long breath. They thought the land was slipping from my fingers, but it was only now that I remembered just how firmly I could hold on. By morning, the weather had turned brittle. The kind of cold where the air feels thin, as if it's been stretched too far. I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing an apple, when I noticed a movement outside. Someone walking along the fence line, too far to recognize. Whoever it was didn't linger. They paused, glanced toward the house, then continued down the property edge before disappearing behind the cedar bushes. We hadn't had strangers wandering back there in decades. I dried my hands slowly. The feeling of being watched doesn't come suddenly. It arrives like a smell, faint at first, then unmistakable. Yesterday's tire tracks. Today's silhouette. It was becoming clear. Thomas wasn't just curious about the land. He was moving with purpose. After breakfast, I took the long path behind the house, the one my husband and I used to walk every evening. The blackberry vines tugged weakly at my skirt, and the grass, yellow from the season, bent under my steps. When I reached the top of the small rise, I saw it immediately. Fresh boot prints near the boundary stakes. Someone had been measuring. So much for pretending they only cared about my safety. On my way back, I ran into Helen. She was clipping the dead heads off her marigolds, bundled in a puffy jacket despite the mild chill. "You look troubled," she said, squinting at me. "I saw someone near the back acreage again," I answered. She made a face. "Developers have been sniffing around this area for months. You know how the town council is. They'd pave over the cemetery if it brought in tax revenue." I felt a twist in my stomach, a quiet anger, but I kept my voice level. "Did Thomas mention anything to you? Your nephew?" She shook her head. "Only that he's been handling some property matters." She made air quotes without hiding her disapproval. "He should be talking to you, not parading around behind your back." I didn't argue. Helen has always had a practical way of cutting to the truth. In the afternoon, Thomas came by again. He didn't bother to hide his impatience this time. He rang the bell twice, hard, like a debt collector. "Aunt Margaret, we need to have a serious conversation." He stepped inside without waiting for permission. His jacket wasn't even zipped. He must have rushed here. Laura followed, her face composed, but her eyes darting around like she expected to catch me doing something inappropriate, like signing papers I shouldn't sign. Thomas paced the living room, then stopped abruptly. "Look, the property is becoming a liability. There are maintenance issues, erosion points, and you don't have the means to deal with all that. The land has stood just fine for nearly a century," I said. "Things change," he snapped. "And you can't keep living like it's 30 years ago. You need support, professional care, a facility that—" "A grave you already picked out for me?" I asked evenly. His mouth opened, then shut again. Laura's head jerked up, her smile freezing. "I didn't mean that literally," he said. "You're twisting my words." "No," I said. "I heard them clearly." He ran a hand through his hair, the tell he's had since childhood when caught in a lie. "Fine," he muttered. "Maybe I exaggerated, but you're making this harder than it needs to be. If you'd just sign the authorization for us to manage the property—" "I'm not signing anything." His eyes snapped to mine, sharp and narrow. For the first time, he looked at me not as an aging relative, not as an obligation, but as an obstacle. "Aunt Margaret," he said slowly, "this isn't going to work forever. You can't stop what's coming." "I can stop you," I replied. Laura gasped softly, though I wasn't sure if it was fear or offense. Thomas stared at me, calculating something behind that stiff jaw. Then he stepped back, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Think about it," he said. "I'll come back tomorrow." When they finally left, the house went quiet again, settling into its familiar breath. I sat down at the kitchen table, resting my palms on the cool surface. The documents were still spread out where I'd left them, patient and waiting. Tomorrow, I would take them to Harris. Tonight, I allowed the truth to settle fully. Thomas wasn't just circling. He was preparing to strike. And he had no idea the land he wanted was already armored against him. The next morning, I dressed more carefully than usual. Not because I expected anyone to notice, no one looks closely at a woman my age, but because it steadied me. I chose my wool skirt, the dark one with the firm waistband, and a blouse that had survived more years than most of the people Thomas called friends. When my reflection looked back at me, I saw the same thin lines around my mouth, the same softening around the jaw. But I also saw clarity, a kind of quiet steel. I gathered the documents into a canvas bag and stepped outside. The air had that brittle, metallic taste early winter brings, though real snow was still weeks away. My joints complained, but I kept walking. I'd walked through worse in my life. The drive to Harris's office took nearly 40 minutes. I hadn't been there in years, not since my husband's estate was settled. The town beyond ours seemed louder, quicker, full of people who didn't bother to look where they were going. When I arrived, the small law office was just as I remembered. Brown brick, narrow windows, a sign that had faded enough to be dignified. Inside, a young receptionist looked up from her computer. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said. "But my name is Margaret Doyle, and Mr. Harris used to handle my husband's affairs. I'm hoping he might have a moment." Her polite smile shifted, almost nervously. "Of course. Let me see if he's available." She walked down the hallway, knocked softly, and disappeared into an office. When she returned, she motioned me forward. "He'll see you." I stepped into a room that smelled faintly of old carpet and lemon polish, and there he was, William Harris. Time had rounded his shoulders and thinned his hair, but the sharpness in his eyes hadn't dulled. He stood when I entered, leaning slightly on the desk for support. "Margaret Doyle," he said, his voice warm but surprised. "It's been a long time." "It has," I replied, taking a seat. "And I'm afraid I'm here on serious business." He waited, patient in the way only someone who has spent a lifetime listening can be. I opened the canvas bag and laid the documents on his desk. He adjusted his glasses, the frames thicker than I remembered, and began reading. He took his time, long enough that I had time to study the faded map on his wall, the photo of his grown children, the neatly arranged stacks of legal pads. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed. Not alarm, not confusion, recognition. "Well," he said, tapping one of the deeds, "your husband was thorough, very thorough. He structured everything to keep the land secure. You still have full ownership, undivided, no pending claims, no survivorship clauses in your nephew's favor." I nodded, though hearing it aloud steadied me more than I expected. "Has someone been trying to challenge that?" he asked. "No," I answered. "Not yet, but they will." He didn't question it. Instead, he leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "Tell me what's been happening." So I told him, not everything, not the whispers about graves or the way Thomas watched the house as though waiting for it to crumble under me. I told him only the facts. Strangers near the property line, attempts to convince me to leave, Thomas's insistence that the land was a liability. Harris listened without interruption, his brow drawing closer with each detail. When I finished, he nodded once. "I see. And you're right to come now, not later. Property disputes can get ugly, especially when someone assumes a future inheritance is already theirs." He slid one of the documents toward me, tapping it gently. "This gives you far more leverage than they realize. The land can't be sold without your consent. No one can sign on your behalf unless you grant permission. And if you suspect someone might attempt to influence or coerce you—" "I do," I said quietly. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Then we put protections in place, immediate ones." He explained my options, placing the property in a trust under my control, restricting financial access, documenting interference. He spoke plainly, not to scare me, but to arm me. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. Not safety, but preparation. A sense that the ground beneath me wasn't shifting. It was settling. When the meeting ended, he stood and shook my hand with surprising warmth. "Your husband trusted you with this land for a reason," he said. "Whatever pressure you're facing, you don't have to face it alone." I left his office with the documents tucked tightly against my side. Outside, the cold air felt sharper, but I breathed easier. Thomas believed he held all the pieces, but the board, as it turned out, was mine. He just hadn't realized it yet. The wind had picked up by the time I pulled into my driveway, carrying flecks of dry leaves across the gravel like restless insects. I sat in the car for a moment, letting my hands rest on the steering wheel, feeling the quiet weight of what Harris had told me settle into place. Protection was possible, formal, legal, real. And Thomas had no idea how close he was to losing every angle he thought he controlled. But knowledge alone doesn't fix anything. Action does. Inside the house, the late afternoon light cast long shadows across the floorboards. I laid the documents out on the kitchen table again. This time, they no longer felt like artifacts from another life. They felt like tools. My tools. I read through the trust options Harris had outlined, tracing each line with my finger. Everything was clear. I could put the land into a private trust under my management, prevent any outside claims, and appoint a successor of my choosing. Thomas need not be mentioned anywhere at all. I could almost hear my husband's voice, quiet, steady, sensible. "Do what protects your dignity, Margaret. That's what matters." Around 5 in the evening, I heard a car door slam. Firm, quick. Heavy footsteps followed. Thomas didn't even bother knocking politely. He rapped on the door twice, sharp and impatient. I opened it slowly. "Aunt Margaret, we need to talk," he said, brushing past me into the hallway as though he owned the place. Laura wasn't with him today. That told me more than his expression did. This was a conversation he didn't want softened by someone else's presence, or witnessed. He looked around the kitchen and saw the papers spread across the table. His eyes narrowed. "What's all this?" "My business," I said. "Your business?" He laughed lightly, but the sound was tense. "Aunt Margaret, you shouldn't be handling legal documents alone. You don't know what you're signing." "I haven't signed anything yet." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Good, because you're making things difficult for no reason. All we're trying to do is take the burden off you. The property needs to be handled properly. There are developers waiting for an answer." So he admitted it, just like that. No hesitation. I looked at him steadily. "It's not your land to discuss." He blinked, caught off guard. "Well, technically, no," I said. "Not technically, not legally." "Not at all." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "You don't understand what you're up against. The town is changing. There's opportunity here. And we're talking about a future inheritance that should stay in the family." "Future inheritance," I repeated, tasting the phrase. "You speak as though I'm already gone." He didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned closer, lowering his voice again, the same way he had the day he whispered about the grave. "Aunt Margaret, you're not thinking clearly. This place, it's too much for you. You could fall. You could have a medical emergency. You could—" "I could live," I interrupted. "Something none of you seem prepared for." His face hardened, the politeness slipping. "You're being unreasonable. I'm trying to ensure things go smoothly for everyone." For you, I said, so you can sell what doesn't belong to you. That land will be mine, he snapped before he could stop himself. I let the words hang in the air, quiet, heavy, unmistakable. Then I reached for the top document on the table, a copy of the trust Harris had prepared for me to review. I slid it toward him. Read the title, I said. He looked down. His eyes flicked over the words. Private Irrevocable Trust, Grantor, Margaret Doyle. His cheeks flushed. What is this? This, I said softly, is the end of your plans. He stared at me, breathing harder now, as though he'd run up a long hill. You can't just shut me out of decisions that affect everyone. It doesn't affect everyone, I answered. It affects me. Only me. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The anger was there, full and raw and unmasked. Aunt Margaret, you're making a mistake you can't undo. I know exactly what I'm doing. For a moment, something like fear flickered in his expression. Not fear for me, but fear of losing control. Fear of losing the prize he had prematurely claimed as his. He straightened his jacket. I'll be back tomorrow, he muttered. We aren't finished. Yes, I said. We are. He hesitated in the doorway, as if waiting for me to soften, to apologize, to give him another opening. But I simply looked at him, steady as the land itself. He finally left. When the sound of his car faded, the house grew still again. I gathered the documents, stacked them neatly, and placed them in the drawer by the window. Tomorrow, Harris and I would finalize everything. And Thomas. Thomas would discover that the land he thought he could seize had already chosen its guardian. Thomas didn't come the next morning, which surprised me less than it should have. When a man like him feels his grip slipping, he doesn't rush in. He regroups. He gathers his allies, rehearses new arguments, convinces himself he's still in control. I'd seen this pattern in him since he was a boy. He always mistook silence for agreement, stillness for weakness. I spent the morning watering my houseplants, the ones my husband used to tease me about. You're building yourself a jungle, Margaret, he'd laugh, stepping carefully between pots. Now the house felt calmer with them. Green things don't judge, don't scheme, don't measure your worth in acreage. Around noon, I made tea and sat by the window. The frost had finally settled into the ground, leaving the grass stiff and pale, like it was holding its breath. I watched the road, expecting Thomas's car, but instead saw Laura's silver sedan turning into the driveway. She stepped out carefully, smoothing her coat as though preparing for a performance. When she knocked, the sound was soft, almost apologetic. I opened the door. Aunt Margaret, she said gently, could we talk? Her tone was sweet in the way that makes your teeth hurt. I let her in. She walked straight to the living room and perched at the edge of the couch, hands clasped, eyes wide with manufactured sincerity. I'm worried about Thomas, she began. Not about me, of course not. He's under so much stress, she continued. This property situation has completely overwhelmed him. He feels responsible for you, and he doesn't know how to help without upsetting you. I sat opposite her, folding my hands in my lap. I didn't ask him to feel responsible. Well, she said lightly, sometimes people take on burdens out of love. Love. Such a convenient word. She leaned closer. He told me you're considering legal steps. I'm sure you're just exploring options, but it would devastate him if you made decisions that exclude him. I met her eyes. Decisions about my own land? Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. We're one family, Margaret. We should be making choices together. Yet somehow the choices were being made without me. Laura inhaled slowly, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle on her skirt. Thomas only wanted what's best. He's worried about your health. The house is too big for you. And when people your age live alone— My age, I echoed calmly. She blinked, realizing too late how condescending she'd sounded. I didn't mean that in a negative way. You rarely do, I said. Yet somehow it always ends up negative. She stiffened, then softened her voice again, switching tactics. You've always been so independent. But independence can become dangerous. We don't want anything tragic to happen. Imagine if you fell and no one found you for days. I looked at her steadily. You and Thomas seem to spend a lot of time imagining me gone. She opened her mouth, closed it, regrouped. There it was again, that recalculation behind her eyes. Look, she said finally, we know you saw someone near the back acreage. Developers come and go. You shouldn't assume the worst. I didn't assume, I said quietly. I recognized the boot prints. Her face stilled, just for a moment. Then she smiled again, brittle and thin. All we want is harmony in the family. If you'd just signed temporary management rights— No, I said. She swallowed. Margaret, we're only asking because we care. You care about securing the land, I corrected her. That's very different. Her hands twisted in her lap. Thomas is afraid you're preparing something behind his back. I am, I said simply. She looked stunned. People like Laura expect resistance but not honesty. I stood slowly, my knees aching as I straightened. Laura, I know what you and Thomas have discussed. I know what you think I should do with my life, my home, my property. But you forget something important. I've lived alone for more years than you and Thomas have been married. I managed this land when your husband was still too young to tie his shoes without help. She rose too, cheeks flushed. We're only trying to prevent future problems. You're trying to prevent future ownership issues, I corrected. Let's not dress it up. For a moment, the mask slipped. I saw impatience in her eyes, then worry, then something sharper, the realization that their plan was no longer moving forward the way they'd imagined. I'll tell Thomas you're still considering things, she said at last. I'm not considering anything, I replied. I'm deciding. She pressed her lips together and left without another word. When her car pulled away, the house grew quiet again. But the quiet felt different now, less heavy, more purposeful. I walked back to the kitchen, touched the folder on the table, and felt that calm resolve return. They were tightening their net, but they didn't realize I'd already stepped out of it. The next day, I woke with a strange steadiness, as if my body had already decided what my mind was still sorting through. The sky was overcast, the kind of dull gray that makes everything look flattened and distant. It suited my mood. I moved through the morning slowly. Tea, toast, a check on the plants, before finally making the call I'd been rehearsing in my head since dawn. The land assessor arrived just after noon. He was a tall, thin man in his 50s, with a calm, methodical way of speaking. He reminded me of the surveyors my husband used to hire, men who measured land as though it were a living thing, not a commodity. When I led him to the back acreage, he didn't rush. He walked the boundary markers, took pictures, knelt in the dirt to check soil density, brushed moss from an old stone post with the back of his glove. I stood nearby, leaning lightly on my cane, watching him navigate the terrain I'd known for decades. The wind was sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine needles and distant smoke. He paused several times, jotting notes in a small notebook. After nearly an hour, he straightened and looked at me with the sober politeness of someone about to deliver significant news. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, "this is valuable land, more than most people realize." I nodded, though the words still cut through me with an unexpected weight. How valuable? He took a breath. The location is exceptional. The elevation, the accessibility, the size. Developers would be lining up for it. Conservatively, it's worth far more than the figures I usually see in this county. If you ever decided to sell— "I'm not selling," I interrupted. He smiled faintly. "Then you're sitting on a small fortune. And I imagine there are people who know that." There was no accusation in his tone, just an acknowledgement of what he'd seen often enough in his line of work. Families who turned on each other the moment soil turned into money. He handed me a printed summary. Neat columns, clean numbers, a valuation that made my breath catch for a moment. I thanked him, and he left with the same quiet professionalism with which he'd arrived. Inside the house, I set the papers on the table and stared at them. I thought about Thomas's urgency, his calculated gentleness, the grave he'd already picked, as though preparing the ground, my ground, for the future he imagined. I thought about Laura's trembling smile, about the stranger near the fence, about Harris's calm voice explaining my rights. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. It wasn't just greed, it was expectation. A belief that I was approaching the end and that everything I owned should start leaning in their direction. I took a slow breath. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with a quiet, growing resolve. They had decided the land was theirs long before asking whether I intended to leave it. I gathered the assessor's report and placed it with the trust documents. A neat stack. Solid. Unmistakable. In the silence of the house, with the cold wind moving past the windows, one truth settled fully. The land they wanted wasn't slipping away from them. It had never been theirs to claim in the first place. That night, I didn't bother turning on the television. Noise felt unnecessary. The house had its own rhythm, creaking lightly as it cooled, humming faintly with the old refrigerator's steady pulse. I sat at the kitchen table with the assessor's report in front of me, reading each line again until the numbers no longer surprised me. A small fortune, he'd said. I suppose it was, though the land had never been money to me. It had been mornings with my husband, repairing fences, afternoons planting shrubs, evenings listening to the wind shake the orchard we never fully managed to establish. But to Thomas, the land was something else entirely. An opportunity, a doorway, a shortcut. And he believed I was the one in his way. The documents Harris had prepared lay beside the report. Trust papers, restriction forms, authorization revocations. Each one a quiet shield. I smoothed the edges with my fingers. There was no hesitation left in me. Not after what I'd seen, not after the way Thomas had looked at me when he realized the land wasn't already his. I made the first call just after 8 in the morning. The bank manager recognized my name immediately. "Yes, Mrs. Doyle." "We can absolutely suspend all linked payments and freeze external access." Her tone shifted gently. "Would you like those changes to apply today?" "Yes," I said. "Today." She confirmed it twice, as required. When I hung up, I felt an unexpected lightness in my chest. Not joy. No, joy is too bright a word. It was something quieter. A loosening of a knot I hadn't realized I'd carried for years. I had paid Thomas's bills more times than I could count. Helped him through temporary financial troubles. Covered debts he never explained. Half of those things he barely thanked me for. I'd done it because he was family, because I thought kindness was always the right answer. But kindness without boundaries is just slow decay, and I was done with decay. My next call was to Harris. He picked up on the second ring. "Mrs. Doyle?" he said. "I was expecting your call." We set up an appointment for the following morning to finalize the trust. His voice was calm, steady, the way a doctor sounds when he knows the treatment will work, even if the patient is nervous. I wasn't nervous, though. Not anymore. After that, I drafted a single statement, revoking every permission Thomas had ever been granted: power of attorney, property management, financial access. All of it. I printed the forms and signed them at my dining table, my hand steady, the pen warm from the heat of my fingers. By noon, everything was in motion. The house felt different afterward, somehow taller. The silence no longer carried fear. It carried certainty. I made myself tea and sat by the window, watching a squirrel dart along the fence. Life continued in small, practical ways, utterly unconcerned with human schemes. I was still sitting there when my phone vibrated. A message from Thomas. "Why is my auto payment declined? Call me. Now." Another vibration. Laura's car insurance bounced too. "What's going on?" A third. "We need to talk today. Don't make this difficult." I set the phone face down on the table. Difficult. He'd used that word often. Difficult when I asked questions. Difficult when I refused to sign documents. Difficult when I insisted on living my own life. I took a sip of tea, breathing in the steam. For the first time in years, I tasted the flavor fully. Black tea with hints of bergamot, the way I'd always liked it. Not rushed, not lukewarm, not swallowed between appeasements. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the bare branches, scattering a few stubborn leaves across the yard. The world was shifting, quietly, steadily. And this time, I was the one turning the wheel. Thomas arrived before sunset, his car rolling up the driveway too quickly, gravel spitting under the tires. I watched from the kitchen window as he slammed the door and marched toward the house, shoulders tight, steps sharp. He didn't knock this time. He pounded hard enough to rattle the frame. I opened the door slowly. "Thomas." "Aunt Margaret, what did you do?" His voice cracked, not with grief or fear, but with offended entitlement. "The bank said you froze all linked accounts." "Why? Why would you do something like that without talking to me first?" "I did talk to you," I said quietly. "You just didn't listen." He brushed past me, storming into the living room, where the lamplight cast a soft glow over the old wallpaper. It made him look out of place, like a guest who'd overstayed his welcome by several years. "You're making reckless decisions," he snapped. "You could jeopardize everything. The finances, the property negotiations." "There were negotiations?" I asked. He stopped, just for a heartbeat. "I was exploring options." "Options for you," I said. "Not for me." He pressed his palms to the back of a chair, gripping it hard. "I'm trying to secure our future." "You won't be here forever. Someone has to handle these things." There it was. The quiet cruelty again, this time blunt. Not even dressed up for politeness. I walked to the kitchen table and sat, letting my body settle into the chair with slow, deliberate calm. "Sit down, Thomas." He didn't, but he stopped pacing, and that was enough. "I've spoken with a lawyer," I said. His eyebrows shot up. "Why would you do that?" "You made it necessary." "I am your family," he said, louder now, voice trembling with frustration. "You're supposed to trust me. I trusted you for years, with money, with errands, with access, and every time you took a little more. My tone stayed measured, not unkind. Trust isn't a blank check. He raked a hand through his hair. This is ridiculous. You're letting these ideas get into your head, developers, schemers, conspiracies. You told me, I interrupted, that you'd already picked my grave. He froze. There are moments in life when the truth finally lands, when someone hears their own words reflected back and realizes how ugly they sound. Thomas's face went pale, then flushed red. I didn't mean, he began. You did, I said. He tried to speak again but couldn't form the words. The silence between us stretched, heavy and brittle. When he finally managed something, it came out small, almost boyish. I was just trying to prepare in case something happened to you. Something, I asked gently. Like what? He didn't answer. I could almost forgive him in that moment, not for the greed, not for the lies, but for the simple truth that he'd always been terrified of responsibility. He wanted the reward without the burden, the land without the care, the inheritance without the waiting. I'm not dying yet, I said. And even if I were, I'm still the one who decides what happens with my home. He swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. So that's it? You're cutting me out? I'm protecting what your uncle left me, I replied. And myself. He stared at the floor, breathing unevenly. Then he lifted his head, eyes burning with a mixture of anger and wounded pride. You're making a mistake. No, I said softly. I'm correcting one. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. He didn't look back. We'll talk again tomorrow. No, I said. We won't. He hesitated, wanting, needing to have the last word. But I didn't give him anything to push against. I simply stood there, steady, grounded in the house he had tried to claim for himself. He finally left. I closed the door, letting the latch click softly into place. The quiet afterward felt different, firmer, like a foundation settling. I walked back to the table, placing my hand on the trust papers. Nothing dramatic, no triumph, just a truth I had earned. He could whisper about graves all he wanted, but I was still very much alive, and I was finished being managed. I woke before dawn, not from worry, but from clarity, the kind that settles in the chest, warm and steady, like the hush before sunrise. Thomas's anger the previous evening had rolled off me more easily than I expected, maybe because I had finally stopped absorbing it, or maybe because the land beneath my feet felt firmer now, anchored by choices he could no longer undo. My appointment with Harris wasn't until the afternoon, and the house felt too still, too full of my own thoughts. So when the phone rang just after 9, I welcomed the interruption. Margaret? A young woman's voice asked. It's Emily. My breath caught for a moment. Emily, my brother's granddaughter. The only one in the extended family who still visited without needing a reason. She'd been coming by since she was a teenager. Timid at first, then warm, then quietly loyal in a way that reminded me painfully of my brother. Gone too many years now. I was in town, she said, and wondered if I could stop by. Of course, I told her. Come. When she arrived, she carried a paper bag with still warm pastries. She always brought something, though I never asked. She stepped into the kitchen and hugged me gently, with that careful respect younger people sometimes forget to offer. You look tired, she said, studying my face. I'm thinking a lot, I admitted. Not tired, just sifting. She smiled faintly. You always sift better than most people sort. We sat at the table, and I watched her eat one of the pastries the way young people do, quickly, unself-consciously, full of life. Then she grew serious. "Mom said Thomas has been asking questions about your property," she said. "Aggressive questions." I raised an eyebrow. "Your mother talks to you about that?" "She worries," Emily said. "She doesn't trust him, never has." That surprised me more than I let show. People in families often tolerate what they should name. To hear she saw Thomas clearly was grounding. I poured us tea. She waited until I sat down again. "Is everything all right?" she asked. I looked at her for a while. Her eyes were her grandfather's, steady, earnest, anchored in something good. And for the first time since this began, I felt a different kind of ache. Not fear, not anger. Something closer to recognition. This was who should inherit the land one day. Someone who understood its worth without turning it into a price. "Thomas wants the property," I said simply. Her jaw tightened. "I know. He talked to a developer last month. He thinks no one heard." She hesitated. "He's not planning for your future. He's planning for your absence." The room went still. Emily reached across the table, her hand warm over mine. "You don't have to let him push you." "I'm not," I said. "Not anymore." The relief in her face was quiet, but unmistakable. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. She trusted me enough to wait. We spoke for nearly an hour after that. Not about Thomas, not about the land, about everyday things. Her classes, the old dog she'd adopted, the winter coat she couldn't decide whether to buy. Ordinary, human things that made the world feel sane again. When she finally stood to leave, she squeezed my hand once more. "If you ever need help," she said softly, "call me. I mean it." After she left, the house felt full again, not with noise, but with purpose. Her presence lingered like warmth in the walls. I walked to my husband's documents on the table, touched the folder gently, and felt that same quiet certainty as before. The land needed a successor, not someone hungry for ownership, someone capable of caretaking, someone like Emily. And as the hours moved toward my meeting with Harris, the decision that had been forming inside me finally settled into place, solid, steady, and unshakable. Harris's office felt warmer than it had a week ago, though I suspected it wasn't the temperature that had changed, but my own posture. I no longer entered as someone reacting to danger. I entered as someone preparing a boundary, wide, solid, final. He stood when I walked in. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, "everything is ready." We sat across from each other, the documents laid out neatly between us. Trust forms, revocation notices, successor designations. Paper can be thin, almost fragile, yet in the right sequence, it becomes a fortress. "I've reviewed each document twice," he said. "Before we finalize anything, I want to make sure you understand exactly what these protections mean." "I do," I said. "But tell me anyway." His calm explanation moved through the details like water over stones. My land, once placed into the trust, would be untouchable by any outside party without my explicit permission. No relative, not Thomas, not Laura, could challenge it. The trust could continue seamlessly after my life, managed by a successor I chose. Any previous permissions I'd granted were now revoked, fully and permanently. "Who would you like to name as your successor?" he asked gently when he finished. I didn't hesitate. "Emily." He nodded, unsurprised. "A good choice." There was no flourish to the moment, no dramatic music, just the soft click of my pen and the steady pressure of my signature gliding across the page. My handwriting wasn't as strong as it used to be, the lines a bit shakier, but still mine. Still enough. "I'll file the paperwork this afternoon," he said. "By tomorrow, it's legally active." A strange stillness filled me. Not numbness, but a deep-rooted quiet. For months, maybe years, I'd felt something tightening around me, a slow constriction I hadn't been able to name. Now it loosened. Harris watched me carefully, his expression professional, but touched with something like respect. "You've handled this with grace," he said. "I've handled it with necessity," I replied. He gave a small smile. "You'd be surprised how few people your age stand this firmly once pressure begins." "I've had a lifetime of practice," I said. On my way out, he held the door for me. "Margaret," he added quietly, "if Thomas becomes confrontational, do not engage with him alone. Call me. Immediately." I nodded, though I doubted I'd need to. Confrontation is a tool used by people who still believe they can win. Thomas would soon learn he'd lost before he even understood the rules of the game. When I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun lay low across the parking lot, casting long, gold-tinted shadows. I sat in my car for a moment, letting the warmth touch my face. It felt like the first real breath I'd taken in days. Back home, I placed the copies of the signed documents into the drawer beside the window, the same drawer that had held my husband's deeds for decades. It felt right, as if one chapter of stewardship had quietly handed itself to the next. Then I unplugged the house phone for the evening. Thomas had already called 3 times during my meeting with Harris, and I didn't care to hear his voice tonight. Not his panic, not his indignation. There was nothing left to negotiate. As the house settled into its evening creaks, I made myself a cup of tea and stood by the kitchen window. Outside, the field stretched wide and calm under the dimming sky. My land, my husband's land, the one piece of life they couldn't rewrite. Tomorrow, Thomas might come barreling in with anger sharpened by fear. But tonight, I rested in something stronger than anger. I rested in ownership, quiet, rightful, unshakable. I didn't need anyone to tell me Thomas would make his move quickly. Desperation has a rhythm. You can almost hear it if you've lived long enough. By mid-morning, I noticed the quiet shift outside. A car slowing near the driveway, then another pulling up behind it. Not neighbors, not delivery drivers. These were vehicles with shine on them. New, polished, impatient. Investors. I watched from the window, standing slightly behind the curtain. 3 men stepped out first, coats too thin for the cold, shoes that had never touched real dirt before. They spoke with the quick, confident gestures of people accustomed to being agreed with. Then Thomas emerged from his own car, smoothing his jacket, face arranged into that rehearsed professional smile he'd practiced in mirrors since he was young. He didn't knock on my door. He didn't even glance toward the house. He led them straight down the side path toward the back acreage. The message was clear. In his mind, the land was already his. I put on my coat, buttoning it slowly, letting the minutes arrange themselves around me. My joints protested, but I moved with a calm I'd earned. There was no rush, no reason to hurry. Truth does not require speed to make itself understood. Outside, the ground was firm under my shoes, frost still clinging to the edges of the grass. I walked the familiar path behind the house, letting the cold air fill my lungs. By the time I reached the rise overlooking the acreage, Thomas and his visitors were already gathered near the old boundary stakes. He was pointing at the land with sweeping gestures, his voice loud enough to hear in pieces. excellent elevation, minimal grading required, development potential. One of the investors interrupted him, gesturing toward the farmhouse. And the current owner? Thomas hesitated, only half a beat. She'll be moving soon. We're handling the transition. I stepped forward then, letting the sound of my footsteps on the frosted grass announce me. Slowly, steadily, without drama. Thomas turned. His face emptied of color. "Aunt Margaret," he said too quickly, "you shouldn't be out here. It's cold, and—" "I live here," I said. "I walk this land when I choose." The investors straightened politely, unsure of what conversation they had stepped into. One of them removed his gloves and nodded. "Mrs. Doyle, a pleasure. We were just reviewing the property with your nephew." "My nephew," I repeated softly, "has no authority to review anything." Thomas stepped toward me, voice tense. "We talked about this." "No," I said. "You talked. I listened. Those are not the same." I reached into my coat pocket and removed the envelope Harris had given me. I didn't hand it to Thomas. I handed it to the investor standing closest. "These are the formal documents," I said, "showing ownership and trust status of this land, legally filed as of this morning." He opened the envelope, eyes scanning quickly. His brows lifted in immediate understanding. "Irrevocable trust," he murmured. "Sole control retained by Mrs. Doyle." The other investors exchanged quiet looks, professional, detached, already stepping away from the mess forming at their feet. Thomas's voice rose slightly, strained. "You can't just—" "I can," I said. "And I have." He stared at me, throat working as though he were swallowing something jagged. "You blindsided me," he whispered. "No," I answered gently. "I protected myself." One of the investors cleared his throat. "Mr. Doyle, without control of the land, we can't pursue any further discussion." Another nodded. "We wish you both the best." They left without shaking Thomas's hand. He stood there long after their cars vanished down the road, breathing in sharp, uneven bursts. I didn't move closer. There was nothing left to say today. He had brought guests onto ground he never owned, and the ground had simply answered for me. I turned to walk back toward the house, the cold air brushing against my cheeks. Behind me, I heard Thomas call my name. Not angrily, not with authority. Just as someone calling into a space he suddenly realized did not belong to him. But I kept walking, and the land felt steady beneath every step. Thomas came to the house the next morning without calling first. I'd expected it. There is a certain heaviness that arrives with a person who has run out of angles, and I could feel it before he even stepped onto the porch. When I opened the door, he stood there, with his shoulders hunched in an unfamiliar way, not in anger this time, but in something closer to disbelief. "We need to talk," he said. His voice had lost its sharpness. It was thin, stretched, like fabric pulled too tight. I stepped aside to let him in. He didn't storm through the house or pace like before. He moved slowly, as if unsure where to stand. He stopped in the kitchen, near the table where the trust documents had once been spread out. "You embarrassed me yesterday," he said finally. I took my seat. "No, Thomas, you embarrassed yourself. I just clarified things." He winced, not dramatically, but honestly. He looked older than he had a week ago, as though the loss of imagined ownership had carved something out of him. He sat across from me, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "You talked to a lawyer," he said. "You set up a trust. You put Emily in charge after you're gone." I nodded. "Yes, I did." He closed his eyes for a moment, like he was bracing himself against a truth he hadn't believed would ever come. I thought, his voice faltered, I thought I'd be the one to manage the estate. I thought that was expected. It was never promised, I said, but I'm your nephew. And I am still alive, I replied softly, and still capable of choosing whom I trust. He stared at his hands. The silence stretched, not hostile now, but raw. After a long moment, he spoke again. I wasn't trying to hurt you, he said. I just saw an opportunity. And I thought you wouldn't mind. I thought you'd be relieved if someone else handled things. Handled, I repeated. You planned to sell the land before I even knew you'd spoken to anyone. His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. It was a good offer. For whom? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth hung between us, heavy, but finally acknowledged. I reached for the folder beside me, not the trust papers, but the formal revocations Harris had prepared. I placed them gently on the table. These are already filed with the county, I said. You no longer have access to my accounts. You no longer have management privileges. You no longer have any authority to speak on my behalf. He looked at the papers as though they were a verdict. Maybe they were. What am I supposed to do now? He whispered. Live your life, I said. Your own life. Not mine, not the one you imagined taking over. For a moment, I saw something real in him. Regret, perhaps, or simply the shock of facing a boundary for the first time. He sat back in the chair, shoulders sagging. I never thought you'd stand up to me like this, he said. I know, I replied. That was the problem. He nodded once, a small, tired gesture. Then he stood, slower than usual. At the doorway, he paused, his back still turned. I'm sorry, he said. The words were quiet, unpolished, unsure. I hear you, I said. And I did. But hearing is not the same as forgetting. He left without slamming the door this time. His steps down the porch were uneven, as though the ground felt different beneath him now. And maybe it did, now that he knew it was never his to walk with ownership. The house settled around me after he'd gone, its familiar creaks carrying a gentler tone. I stood by the window, watching the wind ripple across the fields, bending the dormant grass in slow waves. For the first time in a long while, the land felt protected. Not just by law, but by intention. Tomorrow, I would move forward. Tonight, I allowed myself the quiet knowledge that dignity, once reclaimed, does not slip away. The days after Thomas left took on a different rhythm. Not quieter, my house had always been quiet, but clearer, as though something had finally settled into alignment. For the first time in a long while, I woke without bracing myself for footsteps on the porch or a voice insisting I needed help. The air in the house felt lighter, the walls less watchful. Even the floorboards creaked differently, as if relieved. I spent a morning walking the land, moving slowly along the path behind the house. The frost had thinned, replaced by a soft winter damp that smelled faintly of cedar and old soil. I touched the bark of the oak tree near the boundary line, its coarse surface familiar beneath my fingers. My husband and I had planted a sapling here decades ago. Now the branches stretched high enough to hold the sky. This land had witnessed every part of my life. Beginnings, losses, ordinary days strung together like small, unnoticed pearls. It had held me through grief and through years when silence felt too big. And it had watched quietly when people I loved began to look past me, toward what they imagined would be theirs. but the land was still mine. Firmly, legally, unquestionably mine. When I returned to the house, Emily was waiting on the porch. She smiled when she saw me, that warm, gentle smile that never tried to shape me into anything smaller than I was. "I heard from Mom," she said. "She said Thomas is reassessing things." "That's one word for it," I replied. We sat together on the porch steps, the cold wood pressing through our coats. She didn't press me for details. She simply rested her hands in her lap, letting the space between us breathe. "I wanted to thank you," I told her, "for caring without expecting something in return." She looked at me carefully, understanding more than I said aloud. "You've always taken care of yourself," she said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew you didn't have to do it alone." There was a softness in her voice. Not pity, not concern, but recognition. The kind people share when they understand that strength and solitude sometimes travel together, whether we choose it or not. "I've named you as the future steward of the land," I said, "when the time comes." She inhaled sharply. "Margaret, you didn't have to, I know," I interrupted gently. "But I wanted to. You see the land the way it should be seen. As something to tend, not to take." She blinked back the emotion in her eyes and nodded once. A quiet, solemn promise. After she left, I made myself tea and carried it to the living room. I sat in my husband's old armchair, the cushions still dipping in that familiar way. Through the window the fields stretched outward, pale gold under the winter sun. I realized then that dignity doesn't arrive with noise. It returns in stillness, when you choose yourself without explanation, when you reclaim what was always yours, when you understand that age is not an erasure, but a vantage point. Thomas would survive his disappointment. He would learn, perhaps for the first time, that entitlement is not inheritance, and maybe in time he would see the truth of it without bitterness. As for me, I felt no triumph, no lingering anger, only steadiness, only breath, only the simple, grounded knowledge that I had protected the life I'd built. And if someone like me, quiet, aging, underestimated, could do that, then perhaps someone reading these words can too. If this story touched something in you, share it, so another woman who's been pushed aside might find her way back to her own voice.